Okay, hello everyone. This is the Velero community meeting on January 18th. And first we do some status update. We are planning to create the patch with 1.10.1 around, and the RC will be around January 20th. And the issue list could be visited here in this link. And the others are for way 1.11, and we are focused on the issue investigation and also some design items. The first one is data movement, and we have created a demo for the built-in data movement for CSS and plot. And the next target is to discuss the design and finalize it, and finally we can create a design PR. And for the resource include and exclude design item, it is ongoing, and we have created a PR, a design PR. And the other one is the volume type filter. This one is also ongoing, and a draft design is submitted. That is for the work items. And the other thing is Beijing team will be on holiday from 21st to 29th. Yeah, and that's it for status. And for personal update, myself is working on data movement POC, and also investigate some issues and issue fixes, and some PR. That is for with 1.11 issues, and some PR has been submitted. That's from my side. And Jimmy.
Yeah, I'm also working on the data movement POC and recorded one demo to show the whole workflow. And the demo shows that we can migrate an app from AKS cluster to EKS cluster. If you have interest in it, you can watch the video. And the second, I am submit one draft design for the handling backup volume by resource filter. It's from my side.
Okay, thanks. And Xin.
I'm working on separating the resource filter into the namespace and cluster scope. And the design document, I think, is pretty detailed in discussion. And thanks for Scott's comments. And I will modify the document as soon as possible. And that's all.
So I have a question regarding the design for the filter. I think we are pretty much in consensus regarding what the user interface should be and what the expected behavior, right? Or are there any additional comment or concerns from Scott?
So I think we've pretty much converged. We had the discussion last week, and then you and I both commented and said, I think we're at this point. Emmett suggested that we may want to focus just on the backup side. We may not need this on the restore side, because the restore side's not quite as complicated in terms of the kinds of filters people use, because you're limited to the backup. So that might limit the scope of what we have to do in 111 if we just do this on backup side. The other comment that was ongoing was the question of whether we should eventually deprecate the old parameters. We don't need to decide that now, because even if we do deprecate it, that's an ongoing process over several releases. My thinking is we create the new parameters now. Once users have a chance to use them, we can kind of decide whether we want to eventually deprecate the old parameters and just keep the new ones, or whether we need to keep them both in parallel. But we just need, as long as there's validation for 111, that for any given backup, if they specify new parameters, they must not specify the old ones and vice versa. So they're mutually exclusive, either the 3 old parameters or the 4 new. You have to pick one or the other. You can't mix them. Okay. And I think we don't need to decide right now whether we want to deprecate the old ones. I think we can wait till users start using the new ones, and then we can kind of make that decision later. Because we even if we do deprecate, they don't disappear immediately.
Okay, thank you. So Shun, I think that we can focus on updating the document to clarify the expected behavior.
Okay.
And after that, after this design is merged, we can implement the backup workflow first.
Yeah,
But
that's
I
right,
think
because
eventually, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, eventually, if you want to introduce the new parameters, we want that new parameters the same experience or the workflow to manage the restore workflow as well eventually. So if time permits, we should implement that. But if
Yeah, that makes sense.
have,
I was just saying, if we're going to do if we just do the backup first, that's the bulk of the pain here for users. In other words, there's a real user need
Right.
on the backup side where you're trying to decide, I
Right.
want to include cluster scope, but only these and so all those complicated use cases
Right.
don't really exist on the restore side, because on the restore
Right.
side, normally you just include everything, and if you are going to limit it, you're already working from a limited backup. So I don't mean we
Right.
don't want it. I just mean that the need is not as great there. So if we do just the backup, that's probably 80% of the problem. If we get both of them in, that's fine as well. And I guess the other point was we had some discussions last week and this week about what we wanted to change, but I guess those recent changes specifically around that third for the cluster scope resources, handling those things that aren't mentioned, and therefore we only include relevant ones. All of that new discussions starting at last week, I don't believe those are in the document yet, just in the comments.
Okay. So Shun, are there any other open questions or you want to discuss in this meeting? Otherwise, I think we can just move forward and make update to this PR and try to merge it.
Yes, I think there's nothing for me to discuss about this.
Okay.
But I think it's already pretty clear.
Okay. So I think I really like the last section where you provide a lot of example and explain what the expected behavior. We just make update to that and clarify the three existing parameters are mutually exclusive with the 4 new parameters. I think that will be good enough.
Okay, thanks all. And the next one, Daniel, please.
Yeah, I've been working on a few issues assigned to me in targeting 1.11 for the IRSA issue. That one looks like a usage error. I've done some tests on my side and things seem to work. The only gap is that we don't have a good way for user to set the service account. I think we don't have a reason not to do that, so I'm adding an option. If user sets this service account, that will be put in the spec of the deployment. If that's left unset, I think the behavior will stay the same. We'll still create a Velero service account and set in the deployment spec. The second one regarding the RESTIC, that one I also didn't reproduce it, but Scott, you earlier in the few months earlier you mentioned that there's a known issue in RESTIC. I'm curious, what was that? So it seems that when Velero triggered the RESTIC command, it feed into the US East 2 region into the RESTIC command, but end up RESTIC somehow try to head the bucket or the URI with US West 1, which is really weird. I think there may be some bug in RESTIC in certain setting in AWS, but I'm not sure why. You mentioned that if you scroll down with Scott, I think Scott mentioned there, if you scroll up a little bit, Scott mentioned there was a bug in RESTIC. I'm not sure.
I was just trying to think about things to try. So I was suggesting there might have been an issue. There might have been a permission issue because it looked like basically with the AWS API there, it was trying to redirect you to the right region, and it looked like we were hitting a permission bug. So it looked like we might be missing one of those AWS actions and permission issues. So I was the suggestion was if what I was including here was not in the policy, add that to the policy and try again, because it's possible. But I noticed the comment after mine said that that was already there, so that wasn't the problem there, I guess. Just looking at the comment after mine.
So, so do you recall the link to the issue? I know it's been a while. If you can't remember it.
I guess the discussion kind of I remember looking into this and then saying, okay, this should be working fine. And then so that's why I was looking into the bucket permission issue, because it looked like since the redirect was failing, maybe there was a problem with permissions, and that's still maybe there may still be a permission issue involved, because I believe Velero is supposed to be doing a redirect, not Velero, but AWS is supposed to be doing a redirect to the right region in this particular use case, and maybe that's failing, but I'm not really sure.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll continue communicating with the author of the issue. If he doesn't respond in the few weeks, I may close this one. I think there may be some way that if we do not set any parameter, you know, it will try to guess the default region in when it's communicating with S3. But in this case, per the log, we have explicitly tell Restic to init a repository in US East 2. So I don't quite understand why Restic is still trying to access US West 1. Okay, but yeah, I'll continue working on this. But if there's no response, I probably will close it as not reproducible.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my thought.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Scott.
Yes. So the item operations JSON PR is one. There's been a fair amount of review and comment back and forth on. I think we're at the point now where most of those recent comments, there's a kind of couple different categories those are in. I think in both cases they're really outside of the scope of this PR. We're kind of talking about next steps. But it's one of them worth mentioning is there was one issue was that came up was the question of, you know, if we're uploading this the backup to the file storage and the BSL and this item operations, and we're in that waiting for plugin operations, the backup sync controller could potentially pull that backup down into say another cluster, and we don't want that because see, right now in the current code, we only upload to a backup to the BSL when it's complete. So the backup sync controller just grabs all the backups. Now that we need to upload the backup metadata, before, you know, while we're in this waiting for plugin operations, and we want to upload that way. If Velero does restart after it goes on to the next backup, we don't lose this backup. We need to, as part of that implementation, update the backup sync controller so that if it's if the backup is in the waiting for plugin operations state, we don't want to sync that down. So in other words, if you have a second cluster that shares a BSL, if cluster 1 uploads the backup because it's moving on to the next backup and it's just waiting for those operations to finish, cluster 2, when it does the backup sync controller runs, it grabs all the backups from the BSL. It needs to add to filter to check the backup phase. And if it's not a completed backup, then we don't want to sync it yet. So that's one thing that's not part of this PR. The need to do it came out of the discussion, but that'll actually be part of that implementation task where we actually do the update where we modify the controllers. The second set of discussions that's kind of come up kind of more recently is about the possibility. It sounds like there's some concern that we may want to, based on, depending on what design we end up going with for the Velero data mover, there may be some need for plugin specific metadata to be added to the interface. The use cases we'd identified outside of that didn't need that yet. The design we approved, you know, back in December didn't include that. So my thinking here is we need to finish that discussion around data mover. If it turns out that we need some additional changes to this interface, then we need to create a separate design PR, decide what we want there, and if it's approved, then implement it. That way, the current work based on the previously approved design can kind of continue without being blocked. But we realize that there may be some follow-on work we need to do. And it sounds like depending on how we end up deciding what we want for the data mover upstream in Velero, if we go with one option, we'll need some additions to this interface soon, possibly even in this V2. And in that case, again, it'll be a follow-on PR that can be done. In other words, if we implement this as designed now, and then do a follow-on smaller PR with that additional change, that's going to be a lot easier to kind of fit into the process to review and to not risk missing the 111 date. So my thinking is that the current code should be based on the previously approved design. In parallel to that, if we do decide we need this additional plugin specific metadata added to the interface, let's have that discussion and as a design PR, and if it's approved, then a follow-on PR can make that modification. That way we don't block the current work, because right now this JSON PR needs to get approved and merged before I can really start digging into the backup and restore workflow changes. So my hope is to get this PR approved and merged soon, hopefully before the 21st when Beijing office goes on holiday. Capture any needs relating to data mover and this additional plugin, specific metadata and a separate design PR that can kind of be started. And then I can, next week or whenever, start working on that backup controller modification to actually implement the weighting logic and all of that. So I think the issues that were brought up are good issues. I think the first set the category that I was talking about a couple minutes ago about backup sync controller and making sure that, if you sync to another cluster or whatever, that cluster doesn't start trying to check status of operations. That's actually an important point that I think was missed in the original discussion. And when I do implement that in the controller workflow, that needs to be taken into account. But I think this question brought up here about if there's possibly needs to be some plugin specific metadata added to the interface that we pass back, we need to have that discussion around data mover and then draft a design PR once we know exactly what we need. So we can say, okay, here's an additional field that we need to, for example, if this is what we're talking about, needs to be returned in the progress, which then Velero will add to the progress operation progress struct. Maybe it's a config map, a map, or something like that. But once we identify the need, then the requirements, we can get a design PR in place so we can say what structs are we going to need to modify. Do we need to modify any of the plugin API calls as well, and kind of work through that as a follow-on PR. And if this is all implemented initially, then that following work will actually be relatively small because it'll just be take these things that we've already implemented, add one more field here, one more field there, whatever logic we need. And that can be some follow-on work that if we need it for 111, we can include it in there. And if it turns out it's not something that's needed until 112, then it can be a V3 API change.
Okay. Yes. For the two proposals, I think we can discuss this further in the data movement design.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
for the current topics, I think for most of them we haven't come to the end. So I believe that we will finish all the topics, and we can merge the PR before this week.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So,
So if we can just go back and review this again, and thinking kind of now that we've had those discussions around, some follow-up work that we need to do, let's go back and look at this specific PR and figure out, is what's in this PR good for here? Can we approve it and we can merge it this week, hopefully, or make changes if necessary, obviously, if there's anything that needs to be fixed. And then I can get started working on the backup controller side.
Yes, I also agree that even we want to add some more additional design to this JSON persistent, we will create another design. And this the current design in V1.11 is not affected. And because the data movement will be implemented in the next release, not the current one.
Right, that makes sense, because basically this is going to be a set of changes that'll be relatively small compared to all this work, but it's changed the design, and then we can decide once we've approved the design and merged it, is this something we need in 111 and we have time to do it in 111, then we can just add it to the V2 stuff here. And if we don't have time in 111 and we don't really need it because, like you said, the actual implementation of data movements is going to be in 112 anyway, then we can get the design approved before 111 is out, but then the implementation can be done in the next release as a follow-on.
So as for the backup sync controller's behavior, I think that should also be somehow reflected in the design, right? The decision regarding like they are waiting for the a plugin operation, or it's in progress, the backup will not be synced. I think you should add that
is one thing that's not. You're right. That part I can do a follow-on design PR that'll be basically be an edit to the overall.
Sure.
We have the actual async design that we approved in December,
Right.
and I made that small design PR change later in December that we approved. I can do a similar small change here to basically call out the backup sync control, because basically backup sync wasn't addressed in that design. We didn't think about it, and now that this came out and with this PR, we realized, hey, we want to make sure we don't sync these things until they're completed. So I can add a section to that document about because we have a section for backup workflow controller changes and restore controller changes. I just need to add a section for backup sync controller. It'll be a relatively small section that will spell out basically the backup sync controller will filter out backups that are waiting for plugin operations and will not sync those.
But for the just to clarify, for the completed backup, do we want to sync the item operations, Jason, or also?
We don't sync any of those files, because see, when the backup sync controller just pulls down the backup CR metadata. Yeah, because the file storage also includes RESTIC backups, and it includes log files and several other things. None of those things get synced. The backup sync controller just creates the Velero backup CR. Oh, and I think it does create pod volume backup. Yeah, backup CRs and pod volume backups. Those are the only two things that get synced. Everything else goes through the download request. So for example, if I do Velero describe, that makes creates a download request, which then pulls data from the BSL. So if I do Velero logs through the CLI, that does a download request to get those logs. And we only pull those down as needed from the API. So these new fields I'm adding in this PR to add to the download request metadata that says we can also pull down item operations. That also will not be synced as part of the backup. That will only be pulled down through a download request, which is needed from which like Velero described, for example, would pull down. So yeah, that's not a concern, because you're right. We don't need to sync that. We just need to sync the backup metadata, but that's not changing. This PR is really just modifying the API to add those new fields to the download request and to the object store, so that Velero is able to pull those down when it needs to. The syncing is only referencing the backup itself, because I was actually looking in the backup sync controller after this PR discussion to make sure I understood what it was doing. And basically what the backup sync controller does is it grabs a list of all the backups from the BSL, it filters out the backups in the list that are already in the cluster, ignores those, and then it creates the rest of them. And so what we need to do is add one more filter there. So not only to filter out the backups that are already in the cluster, but also filter out the backups that aren't complete yet, because we should not be syncing those to remote clusters until Velero is told the backup it's done. But I will submit a design PR that makes that clear, that updates the previous design with a new section for the backup sync.
And another comment regarding the V2, because you mentioned, I haven't follow up the review of the PR very closely, but it seems that we considered some gap in the V2 backup and restore API. I think the reason for us to work on the V2 backup API is that we want to support backup item action plugin API is to support the data movement.
Yeah.
So if there's a gap between the V2 BIA and the actual data movement requirement, I think that
there might be a gap. The thing is that it sounds like because the data movement design is still ongoing, it sounds like from the comments there might be a gap. We might need some additional information. We're not sure yet, and so that's why I'm saying we're going to implement this right, because V2 is not final until 1.11 is out. So any changes that we make to backup item action in 1.11 will be in V2. So even if it's a separate design PR and a separate implementation PR, if it's all done before we release 1.11, it'll all go into V2. It'll just be a modification to the existing V2. And that'll actually be a lot less work than creating a V3 later, because then we have to create all those new directories and these new files and adapters. So if we can get it all in for 1.11, that's ideal, because then it's just a minor edit, adding some new fields to these existing files. It'll be a relatively small PR. If for some reason we decide we don't need it for this release and we only need it next release, and we make it a V3, that's going to be actually more development work, but it'll be on a looser schedule, because then we're going to have to make all those V3 directories and the V3 copies of all this stuff. So, ideally we would include it in V2, but it's still going to be a separate design PR and then an implementation that's going to follow up with this. That way, I'm not blocked on implementing what we've already defined. Meanwhile, once we have a definition for what we want for, if we decide we need these additional fields for data movement, then we can create a second PR, get that design approved, and then get the implementation, which again, I suspect will be relatively small amount of code in that compared to what these PRs are going to have.
Yeah, but my only concern is that I don't think even we found a gap for data movement, I don't think we need a V3. I know
we don't need a V3 as long. Well, I guess there's two things. First of all, if we get it done in this release, we definitely don't need a V3. If we do it in the next release, we may or may not. One thing we've learned in the past is that if you already have a struct that you're passing in this part of the API, and you're adding a new field to the struct that's optional, you don't necessarily need to create a V3, because, and if you add an optional field, then the old code that doesn't reference that field is backwards compatible. So, for example, several releases ago, before we had plugin versioning, we ended up modifying the restore item action execute output struct to add some optional fields to support something new we were working on. We didn't need it to make a new version, because it was just an optional field added to existing structure. So if we decide that all data movement needs is that operation progress struct needs to have a new optional field, that won't require a V3, even if we do it in 1.12. And anything we do in 1.11 won't require V3, because we haven't released V2 yet, so we can just modify V3 as needed. The only time we would need a V3 with this would be if we actually decide that we need to do something after we release 1.11 that adds, completely new structs or changes things in ways that can't be implemented as just adding a new optional field to a struct.
I see. But my point is, if we end up releasing V3 in 1.12, hypothetically, there will be no one implementing V2. So I don't think, I know when there's a break change, we're supposed to be bumping up the version, but the issue is that if we release V2 in 1.11 and we know we're gonna make change to that plugin, we should somehow tell user this one we may introduce new change to this one, and it may not be ready yet. So then no one will be.
We could do that if we do. I mean, I think our plugin versioning process hasn't really specified that. I mean, I think the key here is if we say this is a feature that's not GA, that's considered beta or not stable, because if we say V2 is not GA, users should not rely on it long term. You know, you can build on it in 1.11, but it might not be compatible in 1.12. And as long as you communicate that at release, once we release V2 and we say this is fully supported, at that point we really kind of need to keep it stable. So we can have that discussion. You know, and it may be that the right answer is, but let's first get the design together, because if it turns out that we're just adding an optional field that won't break backwards compatibility, then we don't have an issue here.
Yeah. My point
but you're
is,
right. If we anticipate needing a V3, then we can have that discussion to say, do we need the overhead of a V3? Is there a way to release the V2 without the expectation of stability for that one interface? And I don't know if we have a way of doing this cleanly. I mean, it's going to be messy from a communication user customer point of view if we do that. So hopefully we don't need to, but that's why I'm just saying, let's work on the existing implementation that this already designed and approved anyway, because one thing we don't want to do is block this work on something we haven't decided on yet, you know, in this design. So let's, in parallel to me working on this code here that's, you know, implementing what we already approved, let's also get that discussion going in the context of data movement and in the context of what changes we need to the backup item action. Once we know what those changes are, then we can say, okay, this is a minor enough change that we don't think we would need a V3 anyway. We're good, we're safe. And if we think it's something that could break backwards compatibility, then we want to seriously consider, first of all, can we get it into 1.11? Because if we can make it into 1.11, we're covered. The only situation where we have this messy question of, do we modify V2 versus make a V3, is if we have a breaking change that doesn't make it by 1.11. Then we have to have that conversation. But if it's not going to be a breaking change, we're good. And if we can get it into 1.11, we're good.
Yeah. So I think one option is that, but for better or worse, what I really prefer is that whatever we decide to support as BIA v2, RAA v2, we should make sure they work with the data movement implementation in the future. So if we are not confident about that, in 1.11,
and that's why I'm saying we need to have that design discussion around what change. You know, in other words, if the data movement design discussions determines that we're missing something in the currently approved BIA v2, RAA v2, then we need to pretty much have that next discussion of, okay, what's missing? What do we need to add? And again, if what we're adding is just, oh, our operation progress struct needs some new fields to cover it, and adding those new fields is all we need to cover it, then we just need to write that PR and get it in, because that's a pretty small change. There's no reason not to do it now. I'm not saying I don't want to do it in 1.11. I'm just saying I don't want to block this current work based on something we haven't decided yet. Let's decide it as soon as we can, and as soon as we know what we want, let's implement it.
Yeah. Well, what I'm trying to propose is that maybe we should just supposedly in the end of 1 year we found there's a gap.
Yeah.
It's possible we make some change in the code so that V2 is hidden from the end user somehow. We told them it's not ready, so it's you won't be implementing it because it won't work end to end either way. So that may be a safer place. Then we
in other words, the code's there.
It
works if a user tries to use it, but we don't advertise it as a supported feature yet.
Right. I
mean,
okay.
That's fine too. It still needs to be functional, because regardless of where we're going with the data movement and Velero itself, I know on the Red Hat OADP side, we are going to be relying on this new API in 1.11, even if it's not advertised. So I want to get it complete and functional either way for that reason. But
then you will need to make change to your OADP plugin in 1.12 if you introduce.
If it changes, that's right.
That's fine.
But because we release those together, in other words, whatever OADP we release with 1.12 will have the data movement plugins released with it. So because we're controlling those releases together, I think for our purposes, the backwards compatibility there is less of a concern. In general, for any user of Velero, you're writing a plugin and you're not tying your release to Velero releases, that's when the backwards compatibility matters a lot more, because you don't want someone upgrading just Velero and all of a sudden their plugin's breaking. And that's why, like you said, if we anticipate having to change the V2 plugins, then we want to make sure we're not advertising those as stable.
Okay,
But
so
on the flip side,
uh-huh.
if we do decide that the changes we need are small enough, then we can just get them in. Then this problem goes away.
So it seems that you are making a change to your OADP AP plugins in parallel with the V2 development. So could you share me the date for OADP need this V2 API? So is there normally a time window between the V 1.11 and the OADP consuming Velero 1.11? What's the time window?
Well,
like?
first of all, we haven't actually started updating the plugins to use the V2 yet, just because we only got the V2 plugin merged for backup, December, and the restore plugin is not merged yet. So the API design. So we haven't actually made any code changes on the Red Hat side yet to make use of these new APIs. But I think in general, what we try to do is to try to time our releases so that, if 1.11 comes out, on a certain time, that, the OADP release that is based on 1.11 would come out, some number. Wes is on the call. You might have a better idea of what we generally want to target here. I know 1.11, 1.2 may not match that, but the question was, how do we normally handle this if, we have a new OADP release that's going to come out based on a given Velero release, and obviously we need some time for QE and making sure everything works together. I think the question was, what that schedule and timing tends to look like.
Yeah, because the reason I'm curious about this is that there may be a chance that 1.11 may be delayed for a couple of weeks, considering the status of the backup filters work. So I don't want to impact if there's a hard deadline for OADP, I don't want that to be impacted.
I don't have a definite answer to that question. I do know that we are talking about, we are considering the fact internally that there may be a delay, again, hopefully not more than a couple of weeks. But we understand that an upstream release, target date is just that, a target date. I mean, if you hit a blocker bug, as you're doing final QE, then clearly we have to fix the bug, and so all of that is something that we're aware of. I don't have a more definite answer right now for you, but these are all issues that we're considering, but that's also why I want to make sure that we don't get blocked and delayed in implementing the parts of this design that we've already agreed on, while we're still trying to work out some final details that we also want to get in. So, but I think we're good here as long as we consider that, this is a feature, again, we already had several PRs. There's going to be one for backup controllers, one for restore controllers. So this is not the kind of thing you want to put one huge PR for everything at once anyway. It's easy to review in the smaller chunks. So this new bit of changes that we need, that we're talking about adding a new field or whatever we need to do there, that'll be a separate design, separate PR that'll be relatively small. We'll get that approved. So hopefully that can all still make it in the same time frame. But because we're doing that as a separate step, if it takes us longer, for example, to decide what we want there, and we decide that we're not going to put that in 1.12, at least the rest of this work is still going to make it in, 1.11 rather. But
agree. Okay.
But I think if we can agree on what we need here relatively soon, I don't think there's a real risk here, because if we're really just talking about adding a new field to a struct that allows plugins to add their own data structures in some kind of config map or something, that's not the kind of thing that should seriously delay a release. We're not talking about major workflow changes. Hopefully that's something relatively small that, possibly even someone other than myself can work on kind of in parallel to what I'm doing.
I think we'll find out. The only thing we want to avoid is we introduce V2 in 1.11 and then V3 in 1.12. End up no one is using V2. That's something we want to avoid.
I agree, and hopefully we can find a way to do that if to avoid that.
As we draw closer to the 1.11 release, it sounds like it would be a really smart idea to review the V2 API in reference to what's being planned for the native data mover, and to really be sure that we have everything in it.
Yep.
Right.
And we would be totally understanding of a software release slipping a couple weeks to save months of work later in another release. That's totally fine.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Any other things, Scott?
That's the next part is relatively quick in comparison, but the restore item action implementation PR 5569, that's now ready for review. It's that was dependent on the backup item action when getting submitted first, which was merged already. So that basically does the restore side in terms of the API changes needed for this as well. So I would say between these two, again, the item operations one is the highest priority to get in this week, because that I need that in place before I can do the backup workflow controller work. The restore item action, you know, we obviously need to get it reviewed relatively soon, but that's not going to block me until I finish the backup workflow and then move on to the restore workflow. So between those two, the item operations JSON that's already had some review is the priority to get merged first. But it would be great to get the restore item action reviewed as soon as possible as well, just so that that's off the radar and I can focus just on the next steps. The third one is a small one. That's the Velero plugin example. That basically adds a V2 backup item action plugin. It doesn't do anything with the new functions yet. It doesn't create any asynchronous actions because there's no controller logic that implements that yet. This the existing plugins were already basically, the execute call was just creating a log message so that you could see when you add a plugin it worked, it ran on your items. I added a second, so there's a V1 and a V2 plugin. So this allows you to show that when you add this plugin image to Velero, both the V1 and the V2 plugins both work, they both execute. You see log files for both because of that adapter that's in the API that allows V1 plugins to still work, even though Velero is using V2 now.
Okay.
So this is just the Velero plugin example allows people to test with this. So again, that's a good one to get get merged, get reviewed, but it's not blocking me just because if I need to test with this, I can just use the PR branch. So nothing else depends on that being merged other than someone else being able to access it easily to test things with.
Okay. So yes, it's a great example. And for the IV2, I'm also reviewing it, and I think I can see it can be merged very soon. And anyway, for all the progress monitoring items and I mean PRs, I will try to make them in the good state before the holiday. So
that'd be great. Yeah.
Anything I didn't react very quickly, Scott, you can pin me directly in the channel, and I will
great.
Try to
if we can get these merged before the holiday, that'd be great. And then hopefully when you get back from holiday, I'll have that the next implementation one at least ready in a draft state or something. I'm not sure, but in any case, I won't have any new PRs before you go needed. So let's just focus on getting these existing PRs reviewed and updated as necessary and merged.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks, Yonghui.
And next one, okay, please.
I'm updating the restore process for the metadata to include the finalizer and manage the field. In this change, I think we will change the way how to restore the metadata. We will exclude some of the field explicitly, such as UID owner reference and resource version. And for all other fields, we'll include them by default. And after this change, I think we will not lose some important metadata if there is new field added into the metadata part.
Okay, thanks. And Danfeng.
Yes, I'm working on reproducing and debugging QPG random failure innately. It's highly it should have some deal with the low I/O performance of network storage or other resources, and it's still under investigating. That's all from my side.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's for the status update. And for the discussions. The first one, I think we really have we don't have time to discuss this in the current meeting. So, but I think it is better to start the meeting as soon. So, what do you guys think? Maybe we can set up a separate meeting under the data moment discussion. For example, tonight in Beijing time. So
I have an appointment tonight. I can do any other time, unfortunately.
Yeah, then what about tomorrow?
Yeah, I can do it.
Tomorrow. So what about the time?
Would you do tomorrow same time as today's meeting, or tomorrow evening your time?
I'm both okay for I'm okay for the both time. So what other?
Yeah, me too.
Then we set our meeting at the same time tomorrow. Is that okay?
Shuban and Scott, can you make it your evening tomorrow?
Tomorrow evening, my time, I'm available. That will work for me. Yep.
Yep, works for me as well. Can you guys also give access to the demo video link?
Oh yeah, we tried to use the link
Yeah.
access and it got permission denied. I don't know if that's limited to VMware.
Yeah.
So Shuban, do you mean there is any issue for the accessing of the demo?
The demo recording
Yeah.
video, yeah, we couldn't get access to it. It gave us permission denied.
Okay.
Okay, I'll try to solve it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so it'll be same time. So 8 a.m. Beijing time tomorrow, 7 p.m. Eastern US time tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
But Yonghui, I think we don't need to rush to make quick decisions if we don't we still have concerns. We just want to kick off the discussion.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Identify
I think we need to start the discussions and
Alright.
make sure we start getting these things addressed. But let's make sure we get everything correct rather than, like you said, rushed. Because this is something that for the most part, we're not going to be implementing this in 1.11, but we want it to be well defined. And to the previous point, we want to make sure any API changes that come out of this discussion can make it into hopefully this release cycle.
Correct. That's the goal. Yes.
Yes. So yes, we want to make it in parallel with backup item and result and design, and we will finalize all the. We won't start the create the PR before we finalize everything. Yes. Then this is for the data moment design, and the next one is from Quming. So do you want this is for the volume filter design, right?
Yeah.
So do you want to share some critical information, or do you want to go through this PR?
I want to go through the PR briefly.
Okay.
And could I share the screen?
Yes. Wait a minute.
Hello, everyone. This is the draft design for handling backup volume by resource filters. And if you have any question or opinion, you can please feel free to break me. Currently, Velero doesn't have a flexible way to fill volumes. Suppose there is two scenarios. The first one is that user wants to back up or skip backup volumes in some volumes in different namespace. Currently, user can use the opt-in or opt-out approach one by one our user label selectors. But if there is a lot of volumes, there will be a lot of works. So if Velero could provide one way to fill the backup volume by some common volume attribute, it would be convenient. The second scenario is that currently Velero is not accurate enough for user to choose a specific volume by not invalid port. By patching labels our annotations. So so I think we should have a way to let the user to select one actual target volume by one specific resource selectors. That is very useful if the user uses Velero as the secondary development, they can use their own console or UI in their drop-down list to choose the resource to back or not. And currently we have a lot of filters like include namespace, label selectors, or annotations labels, but it's not flexible to handle volumes. We need a general way to fill volumes. And currently we are working on the backup process, and if time permit, we can consider restore process. And currently we just handle volumes, not support other resources. And it is environment unrelated and platform independent volume attributes that we support. And there are two scenarios, two real user cases. The first one is that user wants to skip PV with the follow requirements. They want to skip all PV datas or skip specific PV type like RBD, NFSSI, etc. They want to skip specific PV size or story class or skip folders. Another scenario is that user have two PVs, one is for the DB, one is for the logs, and they only want to back up DB data, so they need a specific selectors to accurately select target volume to back up. And our high-level design is that we introduce a new flag that is the from file when executing Velero backup create command, and it will generate one JSON file, and the JSON file include all defined rows for the current backup. For the details of the JSON file, we have include and exclude for each filters. And for the one specific resource selectors, we introduce a GVRM way of resource filters that we use the group resource plus namespace names to choose one specific Kubernetes resources. And another is we use the for the attributes on some specific volume attributes. We follow the defined data structure of persistent volume spec. the persistent volume spec is a structure that define the persistent volumes, and there are a lot of variables that we can use to define the attributes, such as the capacity and the storage class name, our persistent volume source. We can look into the persistent volume source. There are a lot of variables, such as a lot of volume sources and variables, such as the EKS and disk, AWS, EBS, and even NFS, CSI. Here, take the NFS, for example. We can look into the structure. For NFS, we can filter the server our path. So I think the persistent volume spec is enough for us to define the volume attributes. The whole JSON file looks like this. When the JSON file have two top level node. The first one is the resource. The second one is the storage. The resource is related to the GVRM selector. For example, if we want to choose PV engine logs to backup, we can define it in this way. And the second node is storage. It is related to volume attribute selectors. In this node, we have a lot of attribute that related to the volumes. And in storage node, we have two sub node, that is the PV and the volume. PV is related to volume snapshot, and the volume is related to file system level backup, that is restrict our copy. That is how define of the JSON file. Currently, our resource filter is defined in backup spec structure. Because our JSON file is very, very big and complex. So if we directly define in the backup spec, it will be more and more complicated, and the CR side will be bigger and bigger. So we want to store the JSON rows into config map, and the backup CRD reference to the current config map. And the config map will be looked at this, and it is equivalent to generate by command like this. And the config map is same dash plus backup name, and in Velero namespace. And the left circle of the config map is, if we use the Velero backup command with the flag from file, then we will generate the config map. And if the backup is being deleted, the config map should be removed. And the resource filter config map should be also persist into object storage, and it should be synchronized automatically when at a startup. Because the resource filter config map is referenced by the backup CR, so the rules in config map is not intuitive. We need to integrate the roles into the output of the command Velero backup describe, make it more readable. For the compatibility part, we already have this kind of resource filters. And for our new volume resource filters, there will be some situation that we should consider. For this one, if the current resource filters has conflict with our volume resource filters, we should respect these all resource filters. Second, the backup item result should be the intersection of the above resource filter and the volume resource filters. Yes, this is the design, the draft design from my side. Is
Yeah,
there
I have
any...
a few comments. I don't think we want this config map to control all the resources. I think initially we may just focus on the PV and the volumes.
Yeah.
Because otherwise this will be conflict with Shun, and this work will be really complicated. And I think in detail, the PV and volume section, they may conflict with each other, right? You may choose in PV to include some storage classing, but in the volume you excluded, or vice versa. Like, what's the logic between these two sections? We may give more concrete example, like what will happen to clarify the design. And as for the referencing, I think it would be better to probably add a field in backup CR to explicitly reference this config map rather than use naming this hidden contraction, right?
Okay.
I'll add some comment in your PR afterwards, so we can continue discussion.
Okay.
Yeah. So generally, the goal is to allow user to set more flexible filter in terms of PVs when they are creating the backup, rather than ask them to annotate or add label to their existing workload. I think we got several issues from customers of VMware or users that they don't want to touch their workload, but they also want to implement the flexible rules for backing up PV. That's why we want to introduce something like this, so that we can provide more flexibility for user to select PV to take snapshot, but which do not require them to make change to their existing workload. I think that's the biggest goal for this design. In terms of implementation, I think we may not have to implement all these include exclude filters. We can just include like type or storage class, but we make sure this filter field format is flexible enough so that we can support more type of filters in future. I think that would be good enough to run 11. So again, we need to reach agreement in terms of the design, and then we implement a part of it. I think that's good enough.
Yeah. Any other opinions from you guys? Okay, and this draft PR is submitted. If you have any opinion or suggestion, you can just comment on my PR. Okay, thank you. Yonghui?
Yes. And yes, thanks, Ming, and let's continue review this PR offline. And I think yes, we have visited all the topics today, and we can finish off here for the today's meeting. And I will set up the separate meeting and send the invitation for the data movement discussion. And thanks all, and have a good day and evening. Bye bye.